Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Apologies have been received from Monica Lennon, so I'd like to welcome Sarah Boyatt, who will be attending in her, as her substitute. First item of business this morning is a decision on taking item 3 in private. Item 3 is the consideration of the evidence we will hear from Zero Waste Scotland. Are we agreed to take this item in private? We are agreed. Thank you. Our second item of business this morning is an evidence session with Zero Waste Scotland. The session is part of the committee's ongoing scrutiny of autonomous public bodies within our remit. Since being classified as a public sector organisation in April 23, Zero Waste Scotland has been responsible for providing expertise on the development of a circular economy in Scotland. And I'm pleased to welcome Dominic Fry, who's the chair, Ian Galland, who's the chief executive, Kieran McGuigan, who is the Director of Finance and Corporate Services, and Jane Beasley, who's the Director of the Circular Economy. And I think, Dominic, you're going to say a few opening words. Sorry.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting us to this committee. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you may know, I've been chair of Zero Waste Scotland for literally just over a year, and I was delighted to join such a well-respected organisation that's doing, to our mind, vitally important work. I'm also pleased to be part of its evolution at such a pivotal moment for both Zero Waste Scotland and for the circular economy. I started as chair when the journey to being a non-departmental public body started for Zero Waste Scotland, which we successfully completed on April the 1st of this year. Indeed, it's a journey which this committee actually kicked off with your scrutiny of what was then the Circular Economy Bill, which included the ambition to make Zero Waste Scotland the circular economy agency for Scotland. The bill is obviously now an act, and it's been followed up with the government's circular economy route map, which looks at the practical steps to switch to a more circular economy here in Scotland. We have our new corporate plan, which is a set of ambitions making the case for a comprehensive rewiring of the economy to tilt the playing field towards a more sustainable resource use and management, and is aligned with the government's ambitions to end our contribution to climate change within a generation. I joined an organisation that is full of passionate, committed and highly articulate people who are consistently demonstrating the art of the possible. As well as championing the circular economy, we've invested in over 300 businesses over the last few years to show that adopting circular economy practices can bring new opportunities, new business, new jobs and indeed new potential. We believe that a properly integrated circular economy offers economic growth and resilience, as well as social dividends for many of our hard-pressed communities. It also offers a firm commitment to a more climate-friendly world where we value what we have. In passing the Circular Economy Act, this Parliament has set up a focus and commitment which, to our mind, sets Scotland apart and which other nations are taking note of. We will never underestimate the role that you, this committee, played in that. You've also given us a responsibility to deliver. We remain committed to that endeavour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dominic. And the easy questions has always come from me at the beginning. So the lead question is, in the last year, what would you classify as your two major achievements?
Well, I think the obvious one is becoming a non-departmental public body. I think we've managed to do that without being distracted from the main focus of our business, which has impressed me. At a board level, I've brought in 2 new non-executive directors, and we have the opportunity to bring in 2 more new non-executive directors by December. So we're reshaping the board. And I'd finish up by saying that the organisation is determined to pivot from being a source of advice, consultancy and research to being much more proactive advocates for the circular economy here in Scotland.
Okay, how many people do you employ, Dominic?
170, is it? 160? 165.
Okay, just doing the maths. I'm not sure I can do the maths quickly enough. Your payroll's 10.6 million. So it's quite a high payroll for 165 people. Where's all that money going? Perhaps, I mean, what's the average expenditure on board members, for example? Kieran?
On board members, not a huge amount. I mean, obviously, we pay our board members according to the Scottish Government kind of pay policy for non-executive directors. So that's a day rate for most board members, which is about 3 days a month. There's 8 board members on our board. I can't do that maths quickly enough myself. But the majority of that 10.6 million is, of course, going on our 165.
So if I've done the maths, which I've now done the maths because I've got a computer that can do it, it would say that your average salary is 64,000.
That's about right in terms of the fully loaded cost of employment. That's not obviously the gross salary of, that we would advertise a job on. That would include pension, employers' NICs and so on and so forth. So the average salary, actual sort of headline salary, is probably in the mid-40s, I think, something like that, back solving the maths.
Okay. So who's your highest paid person?
That would be our chief executive.
Sorry?
That would be Ian, our chief executive.
So what does Ian get paid?
Do I?
Well, you're a public body.
Yeah,
I mean,
it will be in our report and accounts. I don't actually know. I know it's in line with the guidance. I do know.
Well, the chief executive of Scottish Water, when we had him come in, couldn't remember what his salary is. I'm sure Ian can remember what his salary is.
Yeah, I'm happy to divulge it. I just wonder, is this the appropriate place to divulge my salary? I'm paid within a range which is set by government pay policy.
Well, if you give me the range, that's fine.
Well, the range for chief execs, I think, is 105 to about 175. So it's quite a broad range.
It is quite a broad range.
We can share that with the committee, but that is consistent with all public bodies in Scotland, which is something that we've always, to some extent, abided by over the years, even prior to being a public body, that we would stick to the government pay policy, and we've maintained that. So
it's within the range that's more than the First Minister?
I'm not aware of what the First Minister's pay is, if I'm really honest. So.
Oh, well, maybe as Parliament we look too closely at what people's salaries are. But basically it's a huge increase, it's a huge sum of 31 million, which is your total budget. Is a third of it is going in salaries. Is that right?
Sorry, I'm just waiting. So that total income that you'll be looking at includes capital funding that flows through us for the Recycling Improvement Fund. So actually, I would say that it's more than that. Our revenue budget, which is the key thing for sort of funding the operation, is actually only about 18 million a year. So we actually deliberately aim for about 60 to 65% of our money to be spent on payroll. We are primarily an expertise organisation. That is absolutely where the money is going, is on people. That's, we don't look at that as money we're spending on payroll should be being spent on something else. We do look at that as the core, that expertise across the organisation. Those 165 people are the focus, and obviously making sure we get value out of that. But it's a deliberate targeting of about 60 to 65% of our revenue funding on payroll.
So, Kieran, just within that, just so I can understand, are there any bonuses that are applicable?
No, absolutely not.
So it's just base salary?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Next questions, I think, come from the Deputy Convener, Michael Matheson. Michael.
Yeah, good morning. Obviously, there's a piece of work being undertaken just now to develop a circular economy strategy. What, in your view, would make a good circular economy strategy?
So, thank you for that question. For us, it's really essential that that economic thread, the economic growth in a sustainable fashion runs through the strategy. So it's about targeting where you can expedite that for Scotland and where we can bring the most benefits for Scotland. It's also about having sort of maturity in your kind of attitude towards it, that some things we're going to need to put foundations in to allow that to happen. So targeting particular sectors, say, for example, targeting those areas where we feel we could potentially have some quick wins from a strategic point of view. And it's identifying what those kind of longer-term goals could be. So for us, feeding into it and supporting it. So at the moment, we're providing that technical advice. We are having a look at the research that we've got underway, the research that we've got concluding at the moment, to try and identify where we should be targeting that support. But it's not just get the strategy out this time. It's looking at, okay, what can we achieve in the short to medium to long term with this strategy? It's about building it and looking where we can gain some momentum, and looking at those sectors actually where they're ripe, potentially more ripe for growth, and we can target those more readily. But it's the benefits for Scotland and then beyond.
Okay. So where do you think we should be targeting?
So at the moment, we're looking at the work we've been doing on what we would call the high impact sort of sectors or territories, with net zero infrastructure, for example, built environment. We've been developing some roadmaps within both of those sectors, so we've done quite a lot of work in that space, and we're trying to pull the sort of strategic threads together. We did a big piece of work last year on ecosystems, so changing the conditions that businesses are operating within, rather than having to think about how do you change each business, how do you get businesses to adopt more circular economy practices. So we started with those sectors where actually we've got some traction, where there is a lot of discussion underway in Scotland in terms of the energy sector, in terms of what do we do with decommissioning oil rigs, wind turbines, the material flow that's in there, and looking at material security in that space. So we're developing some roadmaps at the moment. They should be coming to fruition at the end of the first quarter of this financial year. So we're looking at what initiatives, interventions, perhaps policy interventions might still be needed in that space to gain some more traction, to unlock maybe some of the potential barriers to that economic growth in that area in a much more sustainable fashion. So looking at how do we amplify and accelerate reuse in that space, how do we bring forward infrastructure investment to manage if there is that recycling aspect within that space. So for us, they're two key ones. There are others. We're doing quite a lot of work on textiles at the moment as well. So things that are very high impactful from an environmental point of view, and looking at the carbon challenges, and looking at actually material security as well, and looking at how do we build that within the circular economy strategy. So that's what we're advising on at the minute.
Okay. So if you bear with me then, so do you think that the work that you're doing in helping to inform the development of the strategy will help to also create economic value to the Scottish economy? And if so, can you give me a sense of what you think that potentially could be?
Yeah, I mean, that's the intention, definitely. I mean, at the moment, because of the kind of pivot, I guess, from where we were, so from being much more focused on sort of waste, recycling, the kind of pivot that we're doing now towards much more, we're 10 years in, it's much more about that kind of economic positioning. So actually trying to have a valuation on those areas is a key priority for us. So we've also got some work that's coming through at the moment. It's almost like we've got a perfect storm, in a good way, of things that are coming through. So we've got some economic intelligence work that we're just waiting on the data to come through from that, where we're trying to cross-reference where those opportunities are for what we would classify as the more circular jobs, where we would look at material flow. We've got a material value chain piece of work that's just coming to fruition. Friday was the deadline for the contractors to share with us some information on materials flowing through Scotland, existing infrastructure, and then we can identify potential opportunities. So we will be intending to put values within that space, because that will also enable us to target where should we be prioritising action. So if we're going to convince investors to come forward within this space, and we are going to need to put that kind of economic value on it. At the moment, we're still waiting on that data, but it's essential.
Yeah, and so when do you expect to have that data and the work completed?
So partially, and I would say partially because until we've seen it, there's always the credibility aspect with data. So we will have data at the end of this quarter. So by the end of June, we'll have data in terms of net zero infrastructure, building on what we already know within that space, but looking at potentially some opportunities there. The material value chain is imminent. We're expecting to share that with Scottish Government the middle of this month. So we'll have a bit of an idea there. We're doing some QA work. It's the first step on that data coming through. So it's very fluid, but it's this year, you know, we need to be demonstrating where we can kind of get those tractions. So it's not a long-term ask. It's an imminent ask, and it's where we prioritised our research to be able to just sort of push that information out.
Okay, and you can share that data and those papers when they're completed with the committee?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think it'd be very helpful for us to be able to see that type of information. And my final question is, the strategy is due to be published in 2026. Is that the timeline that you expect it to be published in now?
Yeah.
It's on target as far as you're aware?
Yes. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Thanks very much. Douglas, did you want to come in on?
Yeah, come in briefly. Jane, you mentioned investment into infrastructure. Do you think, is that going to require Scottish Government money as well, or do you see that just being private money coming in? Or I guess it could be people like SNIB, for example?
Yeah,
maybe?
yeah. I mean, I would expect a combination, to be honest, where, I mean, there's work obviously underway with Project Willow and the potential that could offer up for investment. But what we're trying to do is with the right amount of data and information, and we want to create confidence within investors, within the sector. And at the moment, it's quite challenging for investors to invest in, particularly anything that's new or anything that's kind of novel coming through. You know, we've supported businesses, and it's risky for those businesses to try and gain that investment. It is risky for the investors to be able to kind of go in with some confidence. So I would expect, I can't imagine we would overnight have the private sector being really happy to kind of go into this space, but it'll be a combination of things. I think some of the policies that come through, the confidence that actually comes through with the strategy, you know, with the Circular Economy Act, with the route map, with the strategy coming through, it does start to build that momentum. So you start to present a bit of a playing field for investors to go, okay, Scotland's serious, but you know, I would anticipate there may be an ask, like we've had with RIF, where there's been that kind of requirement. But from a business point of view, it's often there is a capital kind of ask to get off the ground, particularly for those kind of novel techs.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned targeting sectors. You know, from evidence we heard last year, construction was a big sort of, in terms of waste, that was a big sort of area. So what sort of work are you doing to target the construction sector? Yeah,
so with the roadmap for the, so we've been quite active, I think, in that space, but we've been active in a way where we've perhaps supported others working, we've led research. We want to be much more sort of strategic in how we're playing our role within that space and how we're opening the doors for others. So one of the roadmaps that's coming through in the summer is going to be built environment with the construction as a key element within that. Having said that, we do have some other work underway. We were successful in a Horizon project. We're one of a number of partners where Scotland is one of the regions, the others are cities. So there's Munich, Copenhagen and Lisbon. It's a multi-million-pound project where we're looking at developing a really rigorous business case for reuse hubs for the construction sector. That's a 3-year project that's underway at the moment. And so the intention will be, we'll do site identification, which is what's going on at the moment for potentially feasible site. And then within, it's a very layered programme, so it's this international programme, but within there's the legal support, there's the support in terms of the tech that's required. So we'll get to a position where actually from an investor, it will look really attractive because you'll have done all of the groundwork to get to a business case potentially. So we're trying to be really proactive. That would be amazing, and that would have potential rollout in other sites in Scotland. So one of the things we're doing in the site selection is not just looking at where's the sort of perfect site now, but where could there be other sites that we could be having those conversations with. We've done some prelim work on the kind of reuse in the construction sector, looking at the challenges. So we're trying to gain the momentum in that space as well and translate that into something really functional.
And I guess that goes back to the design phase as well.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Thanks, Camilla.
Thanks very much. Mark, the next question. Sorry, Bob, did you want to come in on that?
Apologies, Mark. I didn't mean to cut across here. I find a lot of this quite abstract, Jane, to be honest with you. So I've got a concrete example, no pun intended, because it's construction. But it's to make it real to me and my constituents. So I've got 4 high-rise tower blocks that were demolished in Wynford Estate in my constituency. Now, the breakup will be on site, and almost all of the demolished material will be used in the build of up to 400 affordable homes. Is that routine? Does that happen normally? Is that normal practice, or do we have to do more of that going forward, so it's demolition and construction, so it's linked together?
Yeah.
Because quite often when there's demolition, there's regeneration. Is that part of a kind of circular economy net zero approach to construction, just to make it real, convener?
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's all very abstract to me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think where things have been easy, in inverted commas, to do, they are done because it makes economic sense for that to be the case. So the big cost in construction, you are moving really heavy stuff distance. So you're building that kind of cost in. So if you can utilise material on site or as close to the site as possible, one of the challenges, the reason why we talk about these reuse hubs, is because one of the challenges is for some materials it's very straightforward to do that, but not for all of the materials. And we know that if, say, we escalate house building and so on, then we are going to be facing some real issues in terms of materials and material flow. So it's about capturing that if that site doesn't need it. So you're lucky if you've demolished on site and there is a plan following that. If there isn't a plan following that, then it's about material removal, and there isn't the storage space generally to keep things for the next project or another contractor who may need it. And there's also questions over quality and confidence in the material. If it's demolish, rebuild, then the same contractor, you're in control of a system, you're in control of a process. So you will build it in where possible. But the reuse hubs is because we've seen when we we did quite a lot of work prior to the route map in trying to understand what can be done in the construction space, because it's such a big area and the potential for value retention is massive. And while there are pockets of good practice, it's not always across the board. So that's the kind of work we're trying to do, is provide those different opportunities to make sure that there's routes all of the time.
Okay, can I ask the question another way? So I'm fortunate there's these new properties being built and that's the approach been taken. Had this been a demolition job only, is there a reuse hub that material could have went to in an appropriate way in Glasgow currently? What would have happened?
So again, it would depend on whether there was another contractor close by who made that connection. So some of the businesses are pretty good at keeping those links alive and being aware of when there is going to be access to material, but it's not standard. So the idea is if you can develop something like the infrastructure that our hubs would provide, you're then building it in automatically as part of the process.
And that doesn't currently happen. That's where we have to get to, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Mark, back to you now. Sorry.
Yeah.
Came to you and then dumped you and came back.
That's great. Thanks. So I'm interested in where we are really now, post leaving the EU. We've got UK Internal Market Act. There's a lot of potential measures that can be agreed at a UK-wide level. There's potential for, divergence through devolution as well. And I'm just interested in your work in terms of developing particular strands of the plan, how you're kind of working within that kind of landscape of UK Internal Market Act and that sort of approach is, whether the common frameworks are delivering some certainty around measures around product stewardship or other measures that you might be working on. We'll come on to DRS and what drops on Friday a little bit later on in the session, but I'm interested in how you're kind of operating within that somewhat fraught landscape at the moment.
I'll take that. Thanks, Mark. The committee will hopefully be aware that the current UK government has initiated their own circular economy what you can call it, research and evaluation with they're proposing their own strategy for circular economy, which is something that wasn't apparent previously. So that's to be welcomed, and certainly as an organisation, we are engaged with representatives of, well, it's DEFRA at the moment down south. We've met them a couple of times, and we're aware of a number of members of the Circular Economy Task Force that was set up by the UK government as well. Some of them represent organisations that we've certainly networked and had discussions with over the past 3 to 5 years. So we're well aware of what their sort of thinking is. So that's to be welcomed. So I guess it'll be interesting to understand how these two approaches kind of align. Obviously, the Scottish Government haven't released their strategy yet up here. We're obviously working with them on that, and obviously we haven't seen anything from the South. So, but that's an opportunity. That's a clear opportunity to align strategies and thinking. And we recognise that some of the things that we'd like to see need to be done at a UK level, whether that's fiscal instruments such as tax. You've mentioned producer responsibility again, which is predominantly done at UK level, and there's other probably regulatory things that could be done, whether that's labelling, whether it's product standards. Need in the current way the reserved matters need to be done at a UK level. But that's not to say it shouldn't just be left to the UK government. It's through dialogue, and that's something that we are certainly supporting, but it's obviously through Scottish Government officials that conversation is happening at a more formal level, but we're certainly supporting the officials north of the border. So that's an opportunity, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out. I would like to think that we're all on the same journey now, and we can maximise the opportunities, not just for each part of the UK, but for the UK in general.
Would you say that a lot of the evidence and the kind of prioritisation would be the same really across the UK of measures? I mean, there may be differences in terms of exact policies that are implemented, but in terms of like the big priorities that are there in Circular Economy Plan for Scotland, with that, I mean, these are just issues, aren't they, that everybody's facing around how we deal with construction waste, how we how we reduce reliance on incineration. I mean, are there common problems here that are faced everywhere, pretty much?
Yes, and we're obviously led to believe that the UK strategy will focus on specific sectors as well, and obviously, clearly we're doing the same. And those are sectors, because of the evidence, because of the information around the carbon impacts, the embedded carbon, the accessibility of materials into those sectors will be the same across the UK. However, I think the opportunities will possibly be different in terms of economic potential. Now, we've already mentioned our focus on net zero infrastructure, which is proportionally a much bigger prize for Scotland than it is potentially for other parts of the UK. That's not to say they'll not consider it. So I think that the delivery of the strategies would be different, or perhaps have different priorities depending on the area. We've even seen this in Scotland. As you know, we've been working at a cities and regions level, so the actual opportunities are quite distinct depending on which area of Scotland where industry is focused, where opportunities, well, obviously, the rural parts of the north and the south have particular opportunities for their locality. So I think it's in the execution of it that will, you could probably see the difference. But yeah, we'll be targeting the same key sectors. Yeah. And a lot of the things around where the biggest carbon impact, whether that's food waste, whether that's textiles, whether it's critical raw materials, whether it's, as we saw, built environment, are very consistent.
Are there other particular areas where Zero Waste Scotland and the work in Scotland is seen to be leading in that UK context? So are there colleagues in the south that are saying, actually, there's been a lead on this particular issue, that's DRS or anything else which we can learn from?
Yes, I think there is, and certainly colleagues have been up to visit, and I know they've had conversations with not just myself, but they've been up, they've had a meeting with Glasgow City Council and the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce, who have been leading to a great extent on that kind of city's approach to circularity here in Scotland. So there's been meetings with them. I know that officials have been sharing some of the information and evidence that we have as Zero Waste Scotland. And obviously, they're very well aware of the discussions that took place through the committee and through the passing of the Act. So, yeah, I think they're openly accessing that information as much as they can from what we've been doing, say, for the last 10 years.
Okay, and then looking at an even bigger picture across the EU, I mean, do you see particular areas where, you know, we're in complete alignment at the moment, areas where perhaps we're falling behind a bit? I mean, where are we sitting on alignment? And I'm presuming that, you know, this is a conversation that you're having fairly regularly with ESS as well. You're obviously, you know, maintaining, you know, the monitoring of alignment. But I'm interested to know where you think the dial is on alignment across with ourselves in Europe at the moment.
So Europe is really galvanised around the circular economy, particularly in the last 12 months. You'll see that from various things that have happened, particularly with the new Commission coming in. Circular economy is a key pillar. It's one of the 6 pillars, I think it is, in their clean industrial deal that they've set out, and that's all, you know, to do with increasing competitiveness and building resilience, and particularly around access to materials and critical raw materials. Have been signalled as an area that they feel that they need to do more about, you know, retaining the value of the materials that are already in the economy. Some of that's obviously to do with that idea of resilience in terms of the global economic and political situation that we all find ourselves in. But this is huge. I mean, visited Brussels recently, not just in the Clean Industrial Deal. They are taking forward their own Circular Economy Act, and they are gathering information and evidence around that as well. So in Europe, they are definitely upping their game. They're seeing it as really fundamental, not just in terms of decarbonisation and climate change, but it is much more an economic opportunity for the member states to collaborate around a much more integrated circular economy.
So are we falling behind in some areas like critical minerals?
I don't think we're falling behind. I think to some extent we have the ability to feed into that. Our evidence and knowledge and the kind of work that we've done over the last 10 years, showcasing the types of businesses that can thrive in that space. So I think there's certainly a lot of potential engagement. But yeah, there's some other aspects. So they're looking across all of the tools, whether it's producer responsibility, extended producer responsibility, fiscal instruments. They are looking more specifically at these things that are probably not in the area for Scotland, but again, going back to the UK, we could be pushing the UK to get much more aligned to what's happening in Europe, because I think it's about accessing all of those levers that are available to Europe, as they should be to the UK, to actually make sure the circular economy not just ticks along, but really thrives and becomes, you know, mainstream. Okay,
so the vision and the objectives are broadly similar, but what you're saying is perhaps the regulatory and fiscal tools are not being replicated at UK state level in order to drive and meet that vision. Is that?
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair to the UK government, they've really just started on their kind of journey. They've got a task force, and they have, you know, they're putting forward their own strategy, which, you know, hopefully will build on to the legislative picture as well. So they're probably more aligned to Europe at this moment in time in terms of that journey. You know, they're trying to, you know, catch up to some extent the UK government in terms of circularity. Europe's already put in place some legislation and regulation, but they're now trying to build on that to actually accelerate it. So where we fit in, obviously, because of our position, is to kind of ensure that the UK is keeping pace with those wider taxation, regulatory, producer responsibility, fiscal instruments to ensure that we're level.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Douglas, I think you've got some questions you want to ask now.
Yeah, I'm moving on to circular economy targets now. So it's really just to ask, how is Zero Waste Scotland supporting the development of circular economy targets?
So this sort of is folded into the work that we're doing on the kind of strategy. So we've got technical teams who are looking at different options for targets and looking at different kind of mechanisms, I guess, depending on what it is you're trying to demonstrate, and B, the monitoring strategies that need to sort of sit within that so you can effectively measure progress against those targets. So it's a very active programme for us. We've got environmental analysts who are working on it at the moment. We did pieces of work last year that were kind of helping to underpin what would it look like, what could it look like, what are others doing elsewhere. There's big questions over data in terms of what data do we have, what data will we need to have to try and make sure that any progress can be effectively demonstrated against any new approach that's taken. Because one of the things we were keen to do when we were supporting work on the route map was looking at other metrics and other means of looking at how Scotland doing and where does Scotland need to go, because obviously the targets end up driving where the most action is placed and the most funding and the kind of biggest priorities. So they are really fundamental in terms of moving a shift away from, we've been stuck in the kind of tonnage-based recycling target world like everybody else, and it's looking at how do you drive that change, but you need to bring in, the economic angle of things, you need to bring in the environmental perspectives, and there's a suite of different ways you can do it. So at the moment, that's one of our priorities, is to look at what's feasible and share that intelligence with the Scottish Government as we go.
Mm-hmm. Is it going to be yourselves that are responsible for monitoring of the target?
Don't know the answer to that question at the moment. I mean, where we stand with monitoring of targets at the moment, obviously it sits with SEPA as the regulator in that space. But yeah, no, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out where you fit in, whether it's you're just advising on what monitoring will be, but not actually doing the monitoring
at the moment, we're at the early stages of this, so our role is to provide that technical expertise of what's possible and what would be realistic and appropriate.
Okay, and if I look back at the recycling targets, that's something that's constantly missed. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the recycling targets, they're old targets. They were set a fair amount of time ago. They have driven change to an extent. For us, our priority has been on, how do you enhance performance and how do you drive change in that space. The recycling targets have been a challenge, looking at household material. The interesting thing is, if you drive more material through that recycling route, it's not necessarily always the right thing to do if you're trying to adopt prevention measures, reuse measures. Reuse targets are one of the things under consideration at the moment. How do you actually demonstrate that? Because reuse is so ingrained in everyday life. So you'd have to find out a way of kind of quantifying that. So from the recycling targets point of view, you can achieve the overarching target if you have a quiet year in terms of construction. So all of those things don't necessarily drive the performance or the changes that we're after. So I think there is a recognition that we need something better than that. And if we're trying to adopt a different way of operating, if we're trying to move towards, growth that's green, if we're trying to look at other measures like repurposing, prevention measures, we need a different way. We need a different metric. You can't have a tonnage-based metric every single time. So they're not necessarily fit for purpose in the world that we're in now. I mean, we are talking about targets that were set well over a decade ago. And I think everyone sort of feels in a similar position. And there's interesting things, the food target it's a constant challenge. I mean, just reflecting on one of the questions, Mark, that you raised about who's looking to us for where we're sort of moving forward. Behaviour change in food, we've made huge inroads, but that's not translating into where we need to be from a food perspective. So we've thrown an awful lot of technical activity into looking at deep beliefs, looking at how you can get people to do the thing that we would really need them to do in that space, but actually it's economically very viable for them to work in that kind of food prevention space, but it's not necessarily being translated. Nobody's fixed that yet. So we are at the forefront of that and the thinking of that, but that needs to translate into something more tangible. But the minute we're successful at that food prevention, then you are going to impact on your recycling targets because you're taking material out. that would be counted at the moment. So you can see there's a lot of tension between the way the targets have been set up, which we didn't know. Not, everybody set targets on that basis. It's not just Scotland. And now we're in a different position, and it's time to think, okay, we probably need more of a sophisticated suite of targets that we're driving towards. But it doesn't stop us focusing on that need to improve performance. Taking everything away, if you've got more recycling than you want, you know that you're actually reclaiming that material and you're doing something good with it. It's not in the residual stream. So that doesn't change that kind of performance drive.
But, if we look at household recycling targets, I think they've been constantly missed. I'm not sure if they've ever actually been met. I'm just trying to understand what's going wrong there. Is it something to do with Zero Waste Scotland? Is it the Scottish Government? Is it local authorities? Or is it a combination of all?
So for us, for our role in this, it's about we've worked one-on-ones with local authorities. We are now operating on more of a kind of one-to-many with local authorities to try and enhance performance. For local authorities, there are some significant challenges in terms of funding a collection service that can be very greedy from a financial point of view, and when there are other pressures on that service. Lots of local authorities have pulled back on things like communications, which is essential. You have to motivate the householder. You have to make the householder aware of service changes, and that's not necessarily done. So we will play our part to an extent, but actually if we were to fully fill that role, we wouldn't be able to do anything else within that space. It would be incredibly expensive and time consuming. So our role has always been about, okay, how do we guide? We've done option appraisal work with individual authorities who've been really struggling, where we've kind of worked through with them about how they could change their performance, but we're not the ones to then actually go and deliver that. The local authority has to take that forward, has to have the commitment of their councillors. They have to have the budget to do that, which is to an extent where RIF comes in. We worked really hard on the RIF fund, so we've got two teams, two small teams that are kind of separated out in terms of one team looks at supporting the local authority. We target local authorities and say, this is a good opportunity for you. The team will work, they'll help them on the application, they'll work out what would be the most appropriate way to improve that performance. Then the RIF team will get the application through to the point for it to go to the RIF board and so on. So we've applied different approaches to this. We've been really supportive of within the route map, there's a co-design process so the local authorities can really buy into what comes next, because they're the guys on the ground, they're the guys delivering. And if the service isn't delivering, in the way that is going to optimise performance, then it doesn't really matter what advice is being given. The service will be the service. So it's a multi differential approach, I guess, to how do you support a local authority to be the best they can be and make the most of the budget that they've got and look for other things. So all the time we'll work with them on how do you optimise other routes, like minimising your residual by working with the third sector, say, for example. And we've got very good, strong links with CCS. So we'll work with them to say, how does the third sector then tie in with that local authority? So we're coming at it from different angles. But
all that different angles, but from the stats, it's plateaued. And, I think there's good local authorities and there's bad local authorities. So it doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see a big change with EPR potentially. I would say from our engagement with local authorities, there were a fair few who were informally kind of waiting firstly for the route map to come through as to see what the asks would be on the route map. So there was a period from the route map being developed, going through consultation, that local authorities are kind of like, do we invest, don't we invest? What should be a priority? We've obviously got EPR, and there was question marks over how much money local authorities were going to get within that space. That's been clarified to an extent, but there are lots of challenges that local authorities are facing. So our priority at the moment is it's more than the recycling targets, because the composition of the waste is going to change with DRS. We've got ETS coming through. We've got EPR in place in terms of how much money the services are going to get. So there's lots of complexity. So we're trying to model what's coming their way. We're trying to offer support. But there's some really big challenges that they've been facing. But yeah, I think it's been frustrating for some local authorities who can't seem to get any traction. But we've done compositional work with them where actually, even just utilising the services to the best they can be would cause a significant increase in output. So it's not even necessarily that the infrastructure isn't there in all cases, it's just not being optimised or used appropriately.
And last question on that then, household recycling. How do we compare with other countries?
It's very variable. I mean, Wales is always held up as the kind of high performer. They do, and this is not a defence position, they do have a different definition of recycling, but they are performing much stronger, much better. They're much more coordinated. They have a blueprint. The co-design should hopefully get to a place where all the local authorities have bought into a high-performing system and a way to do things, which will increase it. So there's variability. You know, we're certainly not at the top of the leaderboard, but equally we're not at the bottom.
Okay. Thanks, Luna.
Thanks very much, Douglas. The next questions come. Sorry, Michael, did you have a follow-up on this? I wasn't sure. Sorry.
No.
Okay, sorry, my mistake. Bob, you've got the next questions.
I wanted to ask about the ban that's coming in December this year for biodegradable municipal waste. We're on track, apparently, to be ready for that. And I see from my notes that Zero Waste Scotland commissioned a study on preparedness in relation to this also, and I've acknowledged there's also a consultation ongoing about non-municipal biodegradable waste. A lot of change in this area. I don't know if you have any comments about the preparedness for this, but with particular reference to whether there's implications, and I will come back on this, about incineration of waste or waste export, so intended and unintended consequences, and where are we with that December target? I don't know, Jane, is it yourself that wants to?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. So we have, we've supported Scottish Government in the space. We don't have a huge amount of technical expertise in the kind of landfill residual element, because it's not where we operate. Everything that we're doing is that value retention. But we have commissioned work on behalf of Scottish Government, and I think it's fair to say local authorities have been very good in terms of getting their houses in order. We did do some work last year with some individual local authorities. I think there's a couple of local authorities that have still got some contractual challenges in place, which obviously then there's financial consequences attached to that. But the kind of downside, I guess, in being so good at this is making sure that there is somewhere else for that material to go to. And that is a challenge. One of the things that Scottish Government put within the route map when we were talking to them about, you know, what does the future look like in all of this, was the need for a residual waste plan. That's not an area that we're necessarily involved with, but it's an area that it's essential, and we know that there's work going on in this space, but that's not going to be something that's developed sort of overnight. So we're leaning in as much as we can to work with Scottish Government to see, you know, what are the significant issues that they may be facing in terms of having to move material out of Scotland if they can't kind of meet that capacity. And much of the stuff that we're doing in terms of the sort of improvements in performance will be beneficial, but it's the timescale side of things that it's a challenge. So it's a very live conversation.
Okay. I don't think I clarified my initial question, but obviously you've answered appropriately that it's not going to landfill. Biodegradable waste will still exist. It's the pathways for it other than landfill. Now, I'll come back to waste exports, but incineration of waste, my notes tell me that there'll be an overcapacity in the years ahead in relation to, if you like, using waste for energy production. And I've got a note here saying Scottish Government policies, incineration should be thought of as a transitional technology that helps Scotland bridge the gap from mass landfill to a low waste, low carbon, more circular economy. So I suppose from Zero Waste Scotland's point of view, whether you think incineration is a reasonable pathway, or whether we may become overly reliant on it at the expense of other pathways. It'd be quite helpful if you could tell me what those other pathways might actually look like.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. You know, we have seen in other countries where they've scaled up incineration that they're then over capacity and they're having to bring material in. it's definitely in some of the Scandinavian countries, and I know the Netherlands had a similar position to an extent. For us, I guess, if you invest in a particular infrastructure that binds you in for a particular period of time, then there are potentially going to be challenges, because we know the waste stream and the material stream as a whole is changing. And if we're successful at what we do, which we have every intention of being, then more of the material that's out there is going to be valued in a different way. So it's not going to be incinerated. So alternative pathways, you can use anaerobic digestion, you can use in-vessel composting, you can use a whole manner of different approaches to deal with the bio element of materials, and we're fully anticipating those are routes that could be optimised. Those are routes that we're always up for consideration when we're looking at infrastructure. It's certainly one of the areas when we're looking at the bioeconomy that we'll be trying to consider. So at the moment, we've got Material Value Chain Programme, which is a new programme for us in the kind of scope and focus of it. And one of the aspects of that is to look at the bioeconomy and look at how do we generate sort of economic growth in that field within Scotland. And there's certainly lots of opportunities within there, some of them small scale, some of them exploratory. So there are different routes, and there is the potential for it to be a challenge, definitely.
Okay, can I come back to waste exports? Sorry, Ian, did you want to come in? Can I come back to waste exports? Because obviously incineration is one pathway. It's an appropriate pathway, but we should be over-reliant on it. Jane, you've mentioned other potential solutions for that, but I had mentioned waste exports. Where waste exports are used, what happens to that waste when it's exported under licence? I would assume, are we just offshoring some of our responsibilities, or is it dealt with appropriately once it leaves Scotland? Obviously, there's a carbon cost to exporting it in the first place, Ian.
So just to kind of jump in, when you talk about waste, are we talking about residual waste?
So I'm specifically looking at, so I can only refer to my notes, Ian, because I'm an expert in relation to this, but it's the ban on biodegradable municipal waste going to landfill by December
so
this year, which I'm sure would be residual waste, because if you've got textiles and you've got wood that's been put into a kind of mainstream pathway for reuse, recycling, all that kind of thing, that's not residual waste. I'm guessing, and my notes don't tell me whether this is residual waste or not, Ian, that what I've got is biodegradable municipal waste, which will be banned for local authorities put into landfill by December this year.
So export residual waste is an option. So for the industry, for councils at this moment in time, and as Jane said, there are facilities in other parts of Europe which are, because they're making the shift and they're seeing their waste arisings decrease, that they have overcapacity of incineration. So they are potentially an outlet for Scottish waste to be shipped abroad. There's other things around, things like cement kilns and stuff like that, cement industry in other parts who have adapted their input material to take residual waste from other parts of Europe, potentially from Scotland as well, and that we know that's happening. That's all done under licence, it's all done under a regulated regime, and obviously that would be a matter for SEPA to ensure the traceability of where that was going. It won't, that type of waste will not be going a great distance, it will be going into mainland Europe because it's hugely expensive. So there will be a cost associated with that, not just in preparation of that material for export, but there'll probably be a fee once it gets to the location as well. So it's not. So whilst it is an avenue for dealing with an overcapacity of waste, if there was no place in Scotland to deal with that, it has considerable costs associated with it. Carbon on the land, absolutely, but it's waste. Whether it's burnt in Scotland or it's burnt in Sweden or in Denmark, it's still going to produce the same amount of carbon. So that's something that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
But it wouldn't be, sorry, apologies for my ignorance, it would not be exported under licence for landfill. That would not be permitted, I would assume. No, as far as I know it's not, but again that would probably be a matter for SEPA to ask directly how they would ensure. When it's prepared, you would imagine that is, for all intents and purposes, that material is dried. You don't want to be exporting wet waste because of the volume and the cost. So it's usually dried, so it would be, it's been
prepared, fit for purpose for burning rather than for landfill. But whether somebody then goes ahead and landfills it, that would definitely be a matter for SEPA to investigate.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a more general question and then a final question after that, Convener. So, more broadly, how is waste infrastructure in Scotland evolving to support the circular economy? And I suppose what needs to change? And the particular question is Zero Waste Scotland involved in preparing the waste reprocessing infrastructure report, which is a Scottish Government requirement under the Circular Economy Act. So any information in relation to that would be quite helpful for the committee.
Yeah, so I mean, it does go back to the question from the Deputy Convener earlier around about that piece of work that we're currently undertaking on behalf of the Scottish Government, is to look at exactly what these opportunities look like for processing of other materials, so not residual waste. So thinking about all of the opportunities across different material streams, what would that reprocessing capacity, potential capacity look like for Scotland, both from a physical point of view, but also from an economic and wider sustainability point of view. So that is a report that we're currently finalising as we speak, and it's something that we're obviously, I think we've already made a commitment to share that with the committee once it's made public.
Just for clarity, that's the report that I was referring to under the Scottish Government's responsibility under the Circular Economy Act. Okay, so you're leading on that for the Scottish Government.
We're carrying that, and for us that's a critical piece of work. Exactly that. If we can seek these opportunities, these are economic opportunities as well as climate opportunities for Scotland. So it'll give us a real sense of what's possible here in Scotland. How we will then be able to implement these opportunities will be, I'm sure we will have a role in that. But hopefully we'll be working with other agencies in Scotland, whether that's Scottish Enterprise, Highlands Islands Enterprise, other parts of the government, to see how we can best create the right conditions for those reprocessing opportunities to be landed here in Scotland, working with a number of partners.
I suppose finally, if we go back to where I started, Convener, I was asking about biodegradable municipal waste and the ban going to landfill in Scotland by December this year. And the notice I have said the Scottish Government believes that's on track. Is that on track and that target will be met and that will be fulfilled? Does Zero Waste Scotland agree with that? Do you have similar confidence the Scottish Government has?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, Bob, now there are some follow-up questions here. I'm going to go to the Deputy Convener and then to Mark. So, Michael.
Just following up on the questions that Bob Doris was pursuing there and the crossover with SEPA. How do you manage your relationship with SEPA, and how do you make sure that you're aligning the approach that you're taking in trying to open up the circular economy to create economic benefits that come from it, along with environmental benefits, alongside the regulatory role that SEPA have got? How do you manage that, and how do you take that forward as an organisation?
Yeah, thanks. So it's a very close relationship. I think we on a number of levels, we obviously work with them quite strategically at sort of chief exec level, but also on a number of the facets we've already talked about. There is specific work streams that are managed at a programme level. So the Scottish Government have a kind of programme board that oversees the delivery of the circular economy in all its elements, and there's key work streams in that, and there's separate groupings of officials and people from Zero Waste Scotland and people from SEPA who sit on them depending on their technical experience. So it's managed very well. I think there's also a good discussion about not just the here and now, but where we'd like to go in terms of the circular economy and what that means for the regulatory regime, both here in Scotland and at a UK level. So again, some of what we're talking about needs to be a much more UK-centred approach to that. So again, they have an ongoing conversation with the Environment Agency as much as they have with, as we would have with the UK government. So it's managed. I'm not going to say there's some challenges in that in terms of how do you deal with the here and now as opposed to where we'd like to go and what does that mean and how we move that forward. But it is a live discussion to make sure that we are all trying to achieve what we all want, is to see a much more retention of the value of those materials for the economic as much as the climate opportunities here in Scotland. So they're very much focused. I think they have within their own constitution, they have their own focus on the economic opportunities for Scotland as much as for their environment. I think they have that as one of their statutory functions woven into their mission. So it's as much live as it is for the economy as it is for the environment.
Okay, so just to help me understand the route here, we've got two non-departmental public bodies, SEPA and Zero Waste Scotland. If I'm a business and I'm looking to invest in the circular economy, the waste sector, whatever it might be, sort of idea, where do I go? What do I get from Zero Waste Scotland? And I'm not asking you to answer for SEPA, and obviously I understand their regulatory role within the sector, but where do I go? So you know, someone who's looking to develop a business or is in that business, where should I start?
Yeah, so obviously it depends.
You'll sit down with me and discuss what those opportunities are and what I'm thinking of doing and take me through that process.
Yeah, I totally understand. So it would obviously depend on the business, but in the main, if it's going back to the kind of reprocessing opportunities in Scotland, we would be an organisation that we would talk directly with interested parties or potentially, you know, get others, you know, excited about the opportunities here in Scotland, whether that's through impending regulation or, legislation or otherwise. But ultimately, that's where we do work very closely with SEPA, because clearly, if they need to be regulatory compliant, and that we would do that at an early stage. There's no point in leading people up the path, so to speak, and say there's a great opportunity for SEPA to say, sorry, that doesn't fit with the regulatory regime, or we think that's going to be a polluting industry or whatever. So we would have that conversation in situ with ourselves, the business, and the SEPA in the room. So it's not a kind of go off and speak to SEPA. We see this as an opportunity for Scotland. We'd get SEPA involved very, very early in that discussion about the actual regulatory compliance of that industry or that opportunity, and vice versa. If people are approaching SEPA, they'd have that conversation. But if they're thinking about markets, opportunities, business, input material, etc., the SEPA would get us involved very early in that. So it works, you know, in terms of us signposting to each other, I guess, for a better word, and getting ourselves involved in these opportunities up front.
So I think I'm taking from that, Ian, is that they should really come to you first of all, before going to the regulator. And obviously you can get the regulator involved as it progresses. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I'm not trying to... I mean, there are specific industries that you know, if somebody wanted to build a new energy from waste plant, you know, that's not us. We would put them direct to SEPA. We might give them some advice about material flows and the direction of travel in terms of government policy, but if that's the type of industry that they're going for, that would definitely be in SEPA's space. So,
you see, what I'm trying to get to is that, you know, you made quite a virtue of this, the importance of growing the circular economy, etc., and the need for people to invest in it, etc. If you want to achieve that, there needs to be clarity of which door do you go to in order to actually open up those opportunities.
Come to us.
And that's what I'm trying to. That's what I'm trying to get to, is that, you know, somebody my constituency comes to me and says to me, well, look, go and speak to Zero Waste Scotland. They're the best folk to start with, and then we can take it from there. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, Mark, thank you. You're next.
Yeah, so I think following on from that, I was also interested in what your relationship is like with Environmental Standards Scotland. So, you know, if you've got an area where, you know, we've got problems such as battery storage at, you know, waste facilities, SEPA will obviously have a view on regulations, but I'm interested in where you kind of sit within that conversation as well.
Conversation that's at an early stage. I mean, and perhaps that's to do with the setting up of Environmental Standards Scotland. We do have conversations. I'm aware that they have a programme of work, and I think circular economy is coming, if that's the right word. It's certainly programmed in, and we have had discussions about what that would look like for us in terms of involvement, and are we going to respond to their questions, or are we going to sit down and try and maybe talk about some of these areas where we think they could focus on. But other than that, yeah, it's more about awareness of each other at this moment in time.
Okay. And just to come back to Bob's questioning around incineration, I mean, my understanding is that at the moment we're slightly kind of under capacity in terms of incineration and you know, predicted use of incineration, but by the time we get to 2028, we'll be over capacity. So I'm interested in your thoughts, given what you've said already around Scandinavia and imports, exports, you know, the government's consultation at the moment on non-municipal biodegradable waste. What you think will happen to those incinerators that are above capacity in 28? Yeah.
That's a good question. You're right. We could be falling into the same position as some of these other countries in terms of looking for waste to feed them, because obviously they'll have a business case in terms of their operation, in terms of investors looking for the return. So that is going to be a challenge. I think. You know,
I mean, do you think that? Do you think then that the non-municipal biodegradable waste could end up being treated at using that capacity post 28? Or, I mean, obviously it depends if we get there in terms of government having regulation in that.
Potentially, yes.
Okay. Does that concern you?
Yeah, I mean, on a personal basis, it does concern me, because I think we are shifting, you know, the waste management process to another outlet without really thinking about the upstream opportunities, which we are certainly set up to think about. And as long as there is another outlet, then how do we really, you know, that's how do we create the right carrots then? It's more challenging to keep the right carrots to increase the circularity of resources and stuff like that. It's still an outlet for waste. So it's not about being anti-incineration or pro-landfill. It's a case of how do we shift the dial and really accept that, you know, the best thing to do is to get in, you know, start separating the materials out from the waste stream, start thinking about it in a different, more strategic way, rather than simply it's a waste management function that needs to be adapted.
Okay. And in terms of the planning for this then, I mean, my sense is that, you know, before the review that I think Colin Church did, there wasn't much in the way of planning for that capacity. His review then, you know, mapped out, I think, what the opportunities are, but also what some of the concerns are. Do you get a sense that there is a plan going forward for strategic use of incineration in Scotland at the moment that's held by presumably government or local authorities working together, or anywhere really? So this question of 28 and what happens for redundant incinerator capacity or excess incinerator capacity, is somebody got a plan for how that's going to be managed? Or?
So that's what's mentioned, as Jane's alluded to, in the circular economy route map. There is a work stream around a residual waste plan, and that is obviously, you know, been held by the government. So yeah, that is the focus of that, is to exactly look at not just what happens in the next year or two, but what happens beyond, you know, 2028 in terms of capacity, and what are we going to do with our residual waste on an ongoing basis. So yeah, there is a plan being hatched.
There's a plan for a plan.
Yeah, I'm not sure about, because that's one of the work streams we're not involved in as such.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we're not actively involved in that space. But I think the other thing as well to sort of throw into the mix of that is, you know, the more successful we are in, say, the infrastructure and market development piece, then the more attractive we're going to make alternatives. So if you are generating, if you're an industry or a business generating that municipal waste, and we're providing a high-value alternative sort of market route through, you're not going to pay the incineration gate fee. So there's different complexities that are kind of going to be laid in with the work that we're doing as well. So, yeah, there's a lot to kind of think about, I think, in this space. But it's something I would imagine the Scottish Government have at the forefront of their mind for the residual waste plan.
Okay, but it's government's leading on that. You don't have a role in terms of advising or leading on that work? We
don't have any expertise in incineration, so where we're mostly feeding in. So we are obviously really close to all of the teams that work within the space. So where we're feeding in are things like, you know, awareness raising in that market space. So bringing that kind of technical insight as to other factors that are going to impact on any of the decisions that they make in terms of moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, some of the things that we've been involved in is obviously analysis of potential future waste streams as well, what's in the mix. I mean, we've already talked a little bit about extended producer responsibility. Somebody else mentioned the deposit return system as well. There's the emission trading scheme that's going to come, ETS, which is going to potentially take a lot of the plastics out of the residual waste stream as well. So there's changes already that we see happening. So that's the type of analysis we would be feeding, because we're using that information anyway in terms of our own work, in terms of that kind of market potential for these materials. But that's something that this residual waste plan will have to consider, not just the volumes, but the actual makeup of those material streams.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Sarah, you've got some questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Just thinking about the upcoming climate change plan, what advice is Zero Waste Scotland feeding into the plan? You've already mentioned, I think, Ian, about the carbon emissions issue. How do you get opportunities that come through the climate change plan that are going to link waste so that you basically deliver both reductions in waste, but you also get less climate emissions?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it is still a bit of a challenging space, so we are involved, obviously, through the government team that we liaise with quite closely. I mean, obviously, they're looking at the current climate change plan as it's been developed, so we are feeding into that. But as I'm sure you know, that this committee will know as well, the climate change plan is very much based on territorial emissions, and when it comes to waste, it is basically around what comes out of landfill. So therefore that has been, for a number of years, the principal focus of the climate change plan in terms of our work. But as we've just talked about, we have reduced the amount of material going to landfill, and there's going to be a ban on biodegradable landfill, but we've just shifted those emissions to the energy sector in terms of energy from waste plants. So the carbon is still there. So I guess that's probably our first point I mean, I completely respect the fact that the climate change plan is based on an international framework in terms of climate change and countries looking after territorial emissions. But until we're, whilst there's references in the current plan around the circular economy and how it can help, we'd probably argue it doesn't go far enough, and we do need to start thinking more seriously about the wider carbon impacts of our consumption as a nation, as much as we're thinking about the waste. And although there are some references in the current plan in terms of some of the industrial chapters, there probably isn't enough for us that could really highlight what Scotland could do. I mean, that commitment, of Scottish government to end our contribution to climate change within a generation, seems to suggest we need to be looking not just about territorial emissions, we need to be thinking about the embedded carbon and all of the products and materials that we're consuming, which are, the vast majority are coming from out with Scotland. So that's probably our starting point, but we understand, the kind of international framework that the climate change plan, but I don't think that stops Scotland being more ambitious and, meeting the needs of the actual plan in terms of what we're obligated to do, but why can't we start to reference what we want to go by almost going beyond compliance and stating where we really need to drive more circular practice to reduce that carbon impact.
So if you were going to get a joined up win-win on territorial and consumption emissions, what would your priorities be? Because looking at the stats, our consumption-based emissions, our carbon footprint has only fallen by a third, and we have got double the world average of consumption per capita. So what would be the game changers to actually get those stats down so that we're actually got a much more circular economy, but actually as people we are able to reduce our carbon-based emissions?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to some of the answers to previous questions. I mean, our starting point would be that's what we need to be measuring, exactly that. What is our carbon footprint? We need to get that much more widely accepted that that's what we're really trying to target. What's the numbers? So we obviously, started to develop some of the numbers behind that with our material flow analysis. We did the first circularity gap report for Scotland, which highlighted some of the areas where you could you could start to make a difference. But with certainly some of the key sectors and opportunities, we've mentioned some of them already. So having some of that analysis broken down into key sectors and then developing roadmaps on the back of that, so how sectors can reduce their overall carbon rather than specifically their operational or territorial carbon, which is obviously where the climate change plan fits at this moment in time. But we could start to understand what that looks like. How do we change our consumption habits as an economy as much as individually to ensure that we're addressing that? We're not. That's not. That's a growing area of interest, but it's not front and centre of the discussions.
So how do you ramp that up as an issue? Because it's both companies, public sector, about awareness of their emissions that are linked to carbon consumption, and then it's individual members of the public. So like if I want to recycle stuff or get stuff repaired, actually you just have to bin stuff. You know, for things like phones, printers, practical stuff, you can't actually, as a member of the public, it's really hard to, or even material waste, although that looks quite a low challenge to us, but it's what are your target areas where we do need to reduce our emissions, where the circular economy helps?
So some of that, as I said, feeds back to the key sectors. So we've highlighted net zero infrastructure, the built environment. There's some key sectors that we feel we need to target. As set out in our corporate plan, it is about raising, the first element of this is really raising more awareness of the exact impact of not individual products, but the wider economy in terms of carbon, not just our territorial emissions and our operational emissions. How do we start to socialise that? How do we get people more engaged about the impact of everything that we buy? Now, that's not just having a go at individuals, but the wider economy. It's interesting, even 2 weeks ago with the survey, the Scottish Government survey on climate, people still think that the most important thing they can do to fight climate is recycling or reduce their food waste or turn their, reduce their electricity bills, all of which are important. Absolutely, we should be doing that. But we're not talking about how do we individually purchase, the impact of all of those purchases. People are not thinking about our consumption, whether that's reducing our consumption or being smarter about consumption, about buying things second-hand or taking things to be repaired. But on the other side, we need to develop the infrastructure that supports those behaviours and those habits. So it's not just about telling people what they could be doing, or businesses. Businesses are much more aware of this. For some, much more aware potentially because of the costs of materials or the accessibility of materials in terms of the global supply chain. Even the built environment, is a lot of the builders are much more aware of embedded carbon. They've done all the operational stuff in terms of construction, when building buildings and making sure that they use less energy and they use less water. So they are now becoming much more aware that if they're going to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings, they're going to have to think about the materials that they're putting into them. So they're much more aware. It's how can we develop the infrastructure to support that? And that's certainly what our mission is Zero Waste Scotland, to help to identify what those opportunities are and to deliver them for Scotland. But I think it starts with a conversation and having, it comes back to the circular economy strategy, is like having the right framework for monitoring that, but then having targets, clear targets, which are based on consumption as much as they are about waste management at the back end.
So how do you communicate that? Because I think earlier on you said that local authorities, one of you said, aren't putting as much effort into communications with members of the public. And then there's, if you do want to recycle or get stuff repaired, it's actually quite hard to find local opportunities to do that. So how are we going to ramp that up?
So I think, so there's a lot we can do. You're right, there is a role there for local authorities because they tend to be the place where people will go and seek that information. So, support local authorities to share that information more widely or understand what's happening. So, a big part of the work that we've been doing with particularly cities and regions is to identify those businesses that are providing, particularly, as you say, repair and refurbishment services, and we work very closely with Circular Community Scotland, CCS. We've provided support to them to invest in, sharing libraries, sharing repair, hubs and individual businesses across Scotland. So it's about bringing almost mapping those out so people can access the information. But you're right, people tend to go to the local authority for that information rather than somewhere else. So it's making sure the local authorities have the tools and the resources, I guess, to put those things, make those things available to their citizens. But absolutely, there's more can be done. I mean, there is a lot of circularity happening. We keep saying that. A lot of businesses, a lot more repair, a lot more, individual companies providing support services to not just business to business, but to citizens as well. It is growing, whether it's a trend, but it's certainly, we're seeing a lot more interest in this space. But you're right, people are busy and they don't have access to that information, and therefore they'll tend to throw things out.
Yeah, and then it could actually be more expensive to repair than to replace. So there's an economy issue there, which you can't fix, but there's something about getting the sectors to work together or having better standards.
All of that, yes, yes. And some of that, again, in terms of the fiscal instruments that you could use to make that much more competitive, if not, as somebody said, tilt it in the favour of reuse and repair, then that's a discussion with the UK government to bring in that type of framework.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
I think there's still a lot to do, because it's almost cheaper to throw away your printer to buy a new one with the fresh ink than it is to replace the ink in your old one, even if it works. Cheaper. Yeah. So, Kevin, the next question is from you, I think.
Thank you, Convener. And before I move to my main line of questioning, I often wonder if people play back their committee appearances after they've appeared. Because there are sometimes things which I think annoy the general public when they hear from folk. And I'll give you the example of earlier on, there was a machine gun rattle of acronyms. Maybe a question for the Chair. Does the board have a policy in terms of using plain language, understandable language that the public can actually get to grips with? Mr. Fry.
I wouldn't quite put it as a policy. I have a very strong desire, as a relatively new chair, to get rid of jargon and to get rid of acronyms. But probably more importantly, I've also wanted to get the board out to see some of the projects that we've been involved in. I myself have done 6 of those site visits, and we held the last board, or part of the last board, at a recycling facility on the banks of the Clyde, where they set up a new facility to recycle wind turbines. I think this is an area that seeing is believing is very true of, and if you can visit some of these projects, Ian was talking earlier about individuals benefiting from reused or repaired products. Ian and I went to see a business called ACS that hires clothing out. They started as a kilt hire organisation and now hire things as varied as wetsuits and tents. I think it's 15,000 garments a day go through their automated picking facility. So seeing is believing is important.
You give a politician's answer there by not really answering the question to the satisfaction, or my satisfaction anyway, and moving on to other subjects. Are you going to put something in place policy-wise so that there is plain language that's understandable to the public?
We'd certainly consider that. We'd certainly consider that.
Thank you. I would also say that Scotland is not a region, but let me move on to my main line of questioning, and that's round about persistent organic pollutants, forever chemicals and microplastics. And I'd like to know how all of this will fit into the circular economy strategy. So let me start with microplastics, and let me move to an area which, I think many members of the public have no idea that there are microplastics in various products. So let's go to chewing gum, where a large amount of those gums that are on sale actually contain microplastics. What can be done to ensure, and I recognise that some of this will fall within reserve policy, to highlight that that is the case, but beyond that, get those microplastics out of the system?
Yes.
Mr Galland?
So, I mean, again, it is about raising awareness. So I wasn't aware that chewing gum had microplastics in. Forgive me, but yeah, I think the evidence of the impact of microplastics and where they're coming from, whether they're being shed every time we put our polyester clothes in the washing machine or otherwise, there's more evidence. More evidence is now gathering. There's a number of organisations highlighting the health impact. Microplastics are everywhere, all around us. We find in water courses and snow in the Antarctic. So there is more evidence, but again, maybe it comes back to your earlier point, it's not readily accessible by members of the public or citizens to understand what they're buying has not just a carbon impact, but it has a potential plastic footprint as well, for a better word. And it is about making sure that that information is available. Again, that's the situation we're in now. We don't even know. I mean, we talked about, I'm going to say POPs, but I'm now going to shoot myself. I'm going to persistent organic pollutants. Apologies. Because we didn't know. We didn't know that this stuff was there, these forever chemicals and stuff like that. So that's the challenge, not just from a circularity point of view, but for, environmental, regulatory point of view, that we don't actually know what's in the products that we have available to us, and we need to, to some extent get in front of that very quickly. So a lot of, going back to Europe, Europe's very interested in things like product passports, so not just detailing on labels, what to do with your materials at end of life, but actually breaking down exactly what's in those, so consumers and other businesses can start to really get a grip of the materials that are being put into those materials, not just what they are, but where they're coming from, so we can understand the kind of the upstream impacts of that, both not just from a carbon, but from an environmental point of view. So there's a lot more that is beginning to happen on the back of the knowledge that we now have, but that doesn't solve the issue of what the products that are in service today, what they're made of. But it's about making sure that we're communicating that as positively. When I say positively, what's the alternative? If people don't have an alternative to something that they need, then what can be done about that? So we need to ensure that product standards and such like are beginning to take root, not just here in Scotland, but obviously UK, because some of these are reserve matters, to get that information out.
I don't expect you or your colleagues to know everything and what pollutants are in each and every item, but it must be difficult to put together a circular economy strategy to the level that we want to see, when sometimes we're unaware of the makeup of a particular product. But let me move on to products where we are aware. My understanding is that persistent organic pollutant contamination, which of course can cause harm to human health and the environment, that persistent organic pollutants are contained in quite a lot of furniture, and that there's over 125,000 sofas per year which would have to be incinerated here in Scotland because of those pollutants. Is that the case? And if so, how do we change the actual ingredients, the components of products that have these pollutants within? I see Jane nodding.
So yes, the scale of the problem is significant, and probably what's more worrying is that list keeps on expanding as more chemicals and more products, then by association, are sort of added to it. One of the big things that we're working on at the moment is in the product stewardship space. So it goes beyond extended producer responsibility. So it goes way beyond that kind of requirement at the end of the life of a product. And product stewardship is all about that kind of clarity of what's going in the product in the first instance, and then what will be the management routes for that product as it goes through life. So that's a big push for us, and that's something that we really wanted to be within the route map. It's something we're leading on for Scottish Government within particular product spaces in there as well. So that would be your kind of longer term solution, but there are challenges in the here and now that are going to be around for, I'd say, at least the next decade as we're sort of managing things. And it does affect things like reuse markets, because you can't then put things within a sphere where, you know, there are going to be potential harm to people purchasing those products.
So tackling all of this at source and getting rid of these elements out of products right at the very beginning is the way forward. As you are constructing the route map, the strategy for the future, are you putting together a list of those products which you know are not up to scratch in terms of their sustainability? Are you putting together a list of the legislation that may need to be changed to get rid of these nasty elements? And in terms of those lists, how are you communicating with members of the public that these items are maybe not the right things to buy?
So at the moment, the communication with the public isn't there, because we're at the stage of, so the product stewardship research started last year. The means of identifying the kind of priority products, and there's different criteria as to why you would identify certain priority products to be considered as a kind of, you know, push forward on that product stewardship space. But as they become more formed, then obviously we'll be pushing that out. Everything that we do, all of our pieces of research, we do push out. You know, we don't sit on it. And there is a task in hand, which you've alluded to, where we have to translate quite technical pieces of research into really accessible for a wide range of different audiences. So that's one of the things that we do, which is that kind of ties in with your sort of plain speaking inference, that it's essential we do that because these are really complicated areas, and you also don't want to mislead anybody in what you're putting forward, because the position isn't always definitive. Like the latest round of POP data, then you can see what was included in there, lots of furnishings. So what you don't want to do is then have a scaremongering situation, but actually you want to try and guide the public into making more informed choices. And we'll be pushing for potential policy interventions in this space as well. And things like product passports, you know, potentially could play a role for some product materials, but all of this, it's work in progress. More than happy to share it with the committee as it all comes to light. And we will have a communications plan. We have a communications plan attached to all of the levels of work and activity we're involved with, and it differs depending on the nature of it and what the message is that we need to get out, or whether it's for the public, whether it's for business. So this will fall within that as well.
So we have, for many other products, warnings on that product. Cigarettes, huge amount of warnings in the front. Should we have warnings in various products, including there are microplastics in this chewing gum, or there are organic pollutants in this set of cushions?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that we found, we did a big project which is relevant to this, which was looking at ecosystems, and it was looking at, and when we talk about ecosystems, we're talking about the ecosystems that businesses operate within. So all of the externalities that affect the decision-making that businesses go through, that has a knock-on effect on the consumer who's purchasing those products. And in order for people and businesses, so businesses to adopt more circular economy practices, and within that have products which you can manage in a much more efficient fashion, because you would be expecting material substitution, for example, within that circular economy practice. So you would be looking at minimising that environmental impact. So, and knowledge and awareness by the public was a key element to that. So whatever we can do to try and ensure that the public can make the best decision and they're fully informed to make that decision, because at the moment you know, you're blind because you're not aware of these factors. So it's looking at what are those different opportunities that we can do within that. But we're very conscious within that kind of ecosystem space. The thing that had the biggest impact was not just about the kind of prevailing measure of value, but it was about that kind of knowledge and that awareness and that sort of cultural piece that's attached to you as the consumer and that business as the business trying to kind of sell you that product. So, yeah, anything that would help raise that sort of profile but potentially has a role to play.
So a very long answer there, but basically that was a yes. Let's tell
I think it needed a long answer though, because it's quite
products.
complicated, and it's not necessarily, there are sort of so many different facets to this, because you have to give the consumer an alternative. So you're informing them, but you have to make sure that there is something else that they can do, and so that then they can make the decision on that basis. But the way we want to try and translate and kind of change that ecosystem culture for businesses is to make sure that if those circular economy practices are embedded, then naturally these next steps will fall into place. You're not having to fight for them. You're not having to demand them independently.
So I get your point, but I think sometimes we're complicating things. We want to see a circular economy. We want to ensure that we do right for the future. Some of the leading changes that have taken place over the decades have been consumer-led. So why don't we make it simple in some of these cases and point out to consumers via labelling what the products contain, harmful products that those products have. And there are alternatives already, because you mentioned alternatives. If we look at microplastics and many of the leading chewing gum brands, there are natural brands with no microplastics in them now, is my understanding. So, of course, that product would not have to have that warning label, and thus, you know, consumers themselves helping that circular economy and create a better environment. Mr. Gullard, I think you meant to come back.
That, exactly that. I mean, there is obviously the more information you can put on a label about the product. You know, we ran a very successful campaign as such during COP26, which was about carbon. You know, we were trying to demonstrate the impact of everything we buy had a carbon footprint, and we got a lot of positive feedback from citizens on that, because they just didn't realise that. They didn't realise they were buying. So you could, you know, at that time, COP26 was, why isn't there more carbon information available in terms of you're buying the product, so you could extend that to other impacts, whether that's biodiversity loss, you know, water stress or microplastics. Absolutely, having more information on that on the label would help citizens. They say that all the time, you know, up front. But a way around that, as Jane said, is getting the businesses who are doing the right thing to use their packaging or whatever, or their space, their advertising, to say that we're not doing that. You know, this is good, as you said, it's not got microplastics. So that then starts to communicate positively to citizens, and citizens do respond to that. They start to say that's whether they're buying that or they're talking about it more openly. So the more that we're talking about the challenges and the opportunities, whether that's formal legislation that's needed in terms of labelling or more voluntary approaches by the people who are doing the right thing, then absolutely. And you know, part of our job is to kind of highlight that there are alternatives out there. There are people that can measure the microplastics in the materials, or they can demonstrate the carbon impacts of the materials in a positive light, and we need to get that story out.
Plain, understandable language and messaging.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Kevin. The next question comes from Mark Ruskell.
Deposit return scheme. A new hope, let's call it. We've got now the potential for an aligned scheme across the UK, across different parts of the UK. I suppose initially I'm interested in what role Zero Waste Scotland has played in this kind of next chapter, in terms of, you know, the conversations UK-wide level, the development of the scheme, how the experience in Scotland of coming very close to initiating a scheme has fed into where we are right now. And also what your role will be in the run-up to 27, assuming that this scheme does get launched, does go ahead, you know, isn't subject to kind of lobbying and it being undermined, and it's eventually successful. Interested to know kind of what you see your role being not just in terms of policy development, but on the ground, advice to retailers and the rest of it?
I think we'll have a different role this time round, for sure. I mean, you mentioned, you know, the liaison with UK government colleagues has been done at officer level, but that's not been something. Certainly, we've, you know, fed in insights in terms of the knowledge and expertise we had in the run-up to certainly the legislation being passed here in Scotland. So we'll continue to do that. You know, we obviously got some experience, although, you know, we didn't obviously run it, and we'll continue to do that if asked. So that's probably more limited support at this moment in time that has been delivered at a UK level. And there's obviously people in the UK government that are leading on that. Certainly, we'll continue to support, you know, Scottish Government in terms of policy, impact assessments, etc. As you would imagine, and obviously, you know, this committee and Parliament itself, as the legislation goes through, we obviously will continue to support partners. I mean, it's not clear what that support will look like. You know, obviously, you know that we did quite intensive work for each local authority assessing the potential impact of a deposit return system on their collection systems. So that's still, I mean, that's still available. Whether, you know, you can imagine that possibly needs to be updated now because glass won't be included in the UK scheme. Whether that's something we'll be asked to do, you know, we're not quite clear yet. I mean, obviously, there's other people coming to the fore now in terms of responsibility for delivery of that. But I guess the point that we are still very much interested in and want to take a very proactive stance or approach to is the materials that are going to get collected. We did a lot of work previously around what's going to happen to all the glass bottles, what's going to happen to the plastic, what's going to happen to the aluminium cans, etc. What's that opportunity, that economic opportunity for us in Scotland? So we still think that's live, even though it's going to be a UK scheme. We still think there's potential for those materials that are all going to be aggregated, they'll be passed through one system. There's obviously an economic benefit. We know we have companies here in Scotland that need or will be looking for that plastic to play back into their products. Same with aluminium. So that's an opportunity for us. That's key. Sits, I think, squarely in our role in terms of the circular economy and supporting, you know, as the Deputy Convener asked, future business opportunities here in Scotland. So we will still be very interested in it. Clearly, communication, you know, there's a job to be done in terms of communicating with the wider public about the scheme as it's rolled out. Again, it'll be up to the new, I think it was called, you know, the deposit agency, whoever was set up to deliver that now, you know, as of last week. So they'll have a role in that, and I'm sure we'll have something, you know, to offer in terms of support to make sure that everybody in Scotland, you know, when the scheme is launched, is ready for it and you know, accesses the facilities that are necessary for allowing them to participate. So yeah, I still think we have a role, but it's certainly not as central to what it was previously.
Yeah, if I could just ask a couple of follow-up questions. Obviously, a lot of retailers invested in reverse vending machines, facilities. You know, I go past the Aldi in Crieff every week and I see, you know, the unit with the RVM in it. I'm interested how much of that is kind of been mothballed and could be brought back, or how much of it is kind of a sunk cost.
Yeah, so some of it, I know some of it possibly has been mothballed, but another, I mean, I don't have the exact numbers, but some of it was, what's the word? I'm not saying sold, but certainly it was moved to Ireland, because on the back of our scheme not going ahead, Ireland was rolling out there, so some of that infrastructure, like RVMs, was actually, you know, deployed in Ireland, so it wasn't wasted, so it wasn't, so all of that will come again in terms of the deployment of that infrastructure in Scotland, which again is another opportunity because you know, it's one of the areas we did look at. How could we support Scottish manufacturing of it? That was an opportunity in Scotland because we were going to roll this out first. So the companies that were interested in not just thinking about the manufacturing of it, but the ongoing remanufacturing, repair, servicing of those machines, those companies were interested in locating in Scotland. So that is still an opportunity, but there will be those types of service engineers, for a better word, deployed in Scotland. So you can imagine that's an opportunity that we want to harness for Scotland, working with other partners, whether that's Scottish Enterprise or local economic agencies. So, yeah, some of the shops have continued to use them on a kind of voluntary basis and, you know, donating money to charity. I know some of that equipment is still available for people to use, but yeah, all of that's going to come back again. Okay. So again, without getting into the, you know, the intricacies of the, you know, how the scheme will operate and the DRS, there are economic opportunities on the back of that. You know, so some of them that we analysed the first time round are still there for Scotland. So for us, that's probably where we will be, you know, putting our efforts and our energies into.
And in terms of your advice, I mean, I think initially, you know, you pointed to the kind of cost savings that councils could deliver if they weren't collecting heavy glass. What are your thoughts on glass now? Because I'm not really aware of what the options might be, say, for Wales within a UK aligned scheme to put glass into their DRS system. Or not, or whether, you know, glass is completely off the table. But just in terms of policy, I'm interested in your thoughts on glass. Has that changed? Are the benefits still there? Economic, environmental? Is that a destination that glass should be included at some point within these schemes, or do you think the world's moved on?
So we haven't done any further analysis other than the work that we did at the time that showed that there was a massive environmental benefit to glass being involved in that, and an economic incentive as part of the whole scheme. So absolutely, we've no reason to believe that has changed, but we would have to do further analysis if that was the opportunity that the Scottish Government wanted to bring forward, or the UK Government. So I don't think our position has changed, that we would still have preferred glass to be involved in the system to maximise all of the opportunities from an environmental point of view and potentially an economic point of view, because we do have an outlet for that glass in Scotland, particularly, you know, on the back of the whisky industry in terms of glass production. We have 2 facilities in Scotland. So it wasn't about trying to find somewhere to do something interesting with the plastics or the aluminium. We had the glass infrastructure to support. So I still think there's an economic case for Scotland to have included glass. Okay. Does that answer the question?
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Douglas, I think you've got a question that you want to ask.
Yeah, just a brief question, Kieran. I was just looking at the delivery plan. It's probably a question for Kieran. There's a budget line of 490,000 for Evolve Zero Waste Scotland. What is that?
That's effectively our corporate change and transformation costs. So it's primarily to do with staff training in the broader sense, some very specific work in terms of the development of our data architecture and sort of how we manage knowledge and deploy sort of some of our resources digitally. So it's those kind of corporate activities that touch all parts of the organisation.
So are you doing a reorganisation? Is that what that money is in there for, or is that an annual line that's always in there?
It's pretty well. In the 3-4 years I've been there, that a line like that has always been there. I think the traditional truism of change and constants, but it's the sort of internal change dimension. The majority of how we budget is sort of through the vertical sort of circular economy activities, but we recognise that there are sort of developments, whether they're digital developments, that's quite a good example actually, that are best managed across the organisation as a whole, and the costs of those developments go into this line. So it's a horizontal line. So organisational wide is probably the best way of describing
so is that, so obviously it's 490,000 for this year. Is it always been sort of that there or thereabouts? I'm just trying to...
Short answer, yes-ish. I mean, I think it's connected to how we think about, I guess, the investing for long-term improvement in what we do and how we do it. So it's connected, I guess, to sort of our public service reform agenda, and I guess, the sort of, invest to save type mindset that encourages. So, those are the sorts of things where, we do try and carve out, 1 or 2% of our sort of budget, which is what that represents, and supplement that obviously with internal resource, to be trying to constantly be looking for efficiency or effectiveness improvements across the organisation.
Okay, and in terms of becoming a public body, obviously freedom of information kicks in. Is that something that you've seen coming through since the 1st of April yet? And do you think that will be a significant cost going forward?
It's probably too early
Yeah.
to say at this stage what the sort of longer term on cost of being a public body. I mean, we have sort of thought about the sort of various factors of what would put kind of additional sort of cost of compliance in, which is not a complaint, obviously, but it's just to make sure we understand and resource appropriately for that. We haven't been sort of setting aside huge sums of money at all. And we think we can manage this absolutely within our standard revenue envelope. To the specific question of have we seen that happen in the last sort of 6 weeks or so, not particularly. We've always sort of sought to comply with something like FOI in line with the principles, even if we didn't have the formal obligation. So we've always run a bit of a process, which clearly helped the build of an industrial strength process if we had something to build upon. But it's not gone beyond the usual sort of levels yet. Who knows? These sorts of processes will no doubt change that. So we haven't made a long-term decision on what we think the right size of support that we need. Clearly, we've worked with some of our partner organisations to get an understanding of how they resource it. And we've sort of, we think we have the right base for that, but clearly we'll react if we need to, but so far we haven't needed to.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure some of that £500,000 will be taken by Dominic to get rid of TLAs or three-letter acronyms, so I don't upset Mr. Stewart. I totally agree. I get lost amongst the amount that we have in this committee and specifically in this area. But thank you very much for giving evidence this morning. And that concludes our evidence session in public. We'll now move into private. Thank you very much.